So welcome to our after garden party. We had so many great questions in our must-have plants and how to use them webinar that we wanted to circle back and make sure that we answered everything that you asked. We focused on uncovering your garden style and introduced some inspiring plants to match. And the entire webinar is up on Monrovia's YouTube channel, so you can click on that to view. We have gathered our two Monrovia experts, Katie Tammany, CMO and Trend Spotter, and Georgia Clay, new plants manager, to get answers to your questions. So we're just going to kick it right off. Does that sound good, ladies?
Sounds great.
Perfect. Great to be here again.
Excellent. So we had lots of questions about people mixing the different styles. Katie, do you have any advice there?
I think mixing is always okay. And I think that the idea behind the styles was really just to identify what you might be leaning toward. But as I mentioned, I think similar to love languages, we all have attractions to probably several styles. I think the key is, especially when working in a smaller space, to really focus on the impression you want to make and choose a style that you lean toward to guide most of your shopping decisions. But if you're like me and you see a great plant that you just get excited to buy, you're going to make it work in your style.
That's a great point. I've done that several times. We also had several viewers ask if we could recommend plants for their specific zone. And I know that's really tough to do in an hour-long webinar, as we're speaking to gardeners all across the country. Can you talk about some of the ways that Monrovia can help gardeners choose the right plants?
Sure. On our website, one of the tools that we've created to help with that is My Plant Finder. And you can type into My Plant Finder, quick and easy. You can look for particular plants that solve your design problems. Let's say you want a low growing hedge, or you want a plant that blooms at a certain time or in a certain color. You can look up plants that way, actually, and quickly sort through the thousands of varieties that we grow. And when you do that, when you ask those questions, one of the first things that My Plant Finder asks you to do is type in either your zone, if you know it, or your zip code, if you don't know it. And so we will only show you the plants that grow in your region that way. So it's a quick way to see a lot of choices very quickly, but ones that are really designed for your region.
Really helpful. We also had lots of questions around bees and butterflies and attracting them to the garden. How can gardeners find out about more ways that they can find plants that attract those pollinators?
Well, again, one of the things that we have on our website is you can search by pollinator friendly and see plants that are pollinator friendly. I think Monrovia, we're always looking for more plants that can help, bring life to your garden. In a variety of ways, either, through bees, butterflies, birds. And that's, one of the things that Georgia actually focuses on is finding new plants that do that. I don't know if you want to add to that, what I just said about that, Georgia.
Yeah, no, I think you pretty much hit it right on the head there, Katie. Monrovia.com has some great resources, and we're always adding to those, to that list that you can find on that.
And I think, one of the things that, might be kind of surprising to people is that we think about pollinator plants and plants that attract, these wonderful wildlife to our garden as being only, perennials, things with big flowers. But actually, it's really about a diversity in the garden that can be good for pollinators. And I was just in my garden recently noticing that there was a hummingbird that was hovering around my cedar. I was like, what are you doing there? Why are you there? But I think we're always discovering the interesting ways that wildlife interacts with all kinds of plants that may surprise you.
Exactly. We had another question, which I thought was really interesting, and it was about plant names. one of the viewers wanted to know what the difference is between the TM and the R that comes at the end of a plant name, which is just the trademark or the registered marks. So how do those terms how are they different when it comes to plants?
Georgia, you want to go ahead and take that one?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a really good question. So both TM, which is trademark, and the registered mark are just ways of asserting that a phrase or a word or even a design, something is unique and your own. So it's a way of protecting it from being used elsewhere, essentially. So a trademark is different in that it doesn't need to be registered with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. So as long as you're using that TM right away, right when you start using a phrase, and you can prove that you were the first person to use that phrase, you get instant common law rights to that trademark. So it's yours. Whereas when you see that R, that registered mark, there is a little bit more protection there because you registered that trademark with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, which can make it a little easier to show that you were the first person to use that mark. So a little bit in the weeds, but that's the difference.
And we have both. We have many plants that have either the TM or the R. And actually our founder, Harry Rosedale Sr., who founded Monrovia, was one of the first people to really start patenting his plants that he was discovering in nature or creating with breeders. And and that's something that we've continued to focus on, for our whole history.
That's really,
and it really allows, if you see Seaside Serenade Hydrangea, that's our plant because Seaside Serenade is protected by Monrovia. So it's just a way to really ensure that you know what you're getting. Just like, if you bought a Coca-Cola, you know that it came and it's the true recipe. So it's just another way of giving you a little bit more confidence in what you're buying.
That's great. Confidence is always good. So we have a few questions that I'm categorizing really as wish lists that people have. So they're a little specific, but I think it will be very helpful to give the information out. So the first one is one of the viewers wanted to know if there's a crepe myrtle that is hardy to zone 5.
Yes, actually, most will still die back to the ground, but the Bellini series is a relatively new series that's on the market that's root hardy to zone 5. Really beautiful, compact, early blooming varieties, lots and lots of great colors. That's one of my favorite series. But again, like Katie mentioned, that My Plant Finder would be really awesome in this situation. You can look up crepe myrtle by hardiness zone and see all the options that Monrovia is growing. Or if you're curious about any other specific genera in your area, you can also look up that in that way.
Really helpful for us zone challenged folks in the north here. So next question is there a ground cover juniper that grows in zone 10, specifically in full sun?
So I'll give my answer and we'll see if Katie has a better one since I believe she's in zone 10. But
I am.
Yeah, so traditionally ground cover junipers are capped at zone 9. I'm not, to be honest, all that familiar with junipers in full sun zone 10. That's not to say that, you can't do it. There may be plants that work. I would recommend consulting your local garden center or maybe a local landscaper to see if they have any home run winners for your area, because they probably know best and have seen a lot more than I have in your area.
I would agree with that. I don't have any ground cover junipers in my own garden. So I would say ask your local garden center.
That's a great recommendation. They know what's, growing well in their specific areas and are a great resource. So we had one viewer who is looking for a tree recommendation for zone 9. And really specific here, they want one that stays green all year, but isn't a pine or a palm. And they'd like a multi-trunk variety. Any ideas for them?
Yeah, so this is very specific, another tricky one. So I'm not sure what area zone 9 they're in, but maybe something like a Texas mountain laurel might work. A really beautiful native desert plant. It's evergreen and can be multi-trunked. It stays relatively small, so 15, 20 feet, good for those hot and dry sunny areas. So if that's you, that would be a really good one. It does produce a really nice fragrant sort of blue-purple flower in the spring.
Wonderful. Another recommendation, so they're looking for a fragrant tea olive tree.
Yeah, so again, depends so much on your area and what you're looking for. My recommendation again would be just to ask your local garden center and your local garden professionals for their favorites and you know, specifically what sort of space you're trying to fit these plants into. They could really be helpful in that.
Excellent. Now, this question we get, I think, just about every question and answer session or webinar that we've done. Everyone is looking for a truly rabbit-resistant plant. Any recommendations there?
Well, I think, you know, rabbits and deer and all those creatures, they just are, you know, quite not super picky, and they can eat a lot of different things depending on your region. I know Katie and I have discussed this at length a lot, but generally speaking, the things that I tend to look for that are going to be maybe less susceptible to rabbits would be if they have something like a fuzzy or leathery foliage that is helpful, or spiky, prickly, something that makes it a little less enjoyable for the rabbits to munch on. They also, you know, strong smelling plants like mint or lavender or any of those sort of like strong scents. And also sappy stems as well. So anything that sort of makes it unpleasant in the mouth is going to be a good general guide, but of course not always foolproof.
It's true. I mean, I swear by rosemary, you know, as being a good, fairly unappealing plant to a lot of animals, but very hungry deer or rabbit will overcome any reservation. So it's difficult, and it's so localized, you know. So again, I'd say that relying on your local garden center and their advice, and being aware that, you know, it might change. You know, what worked before 2 years ago suddenly might not work, you know, this year. So it's an ongoing relationship we have with nature.
That's very true. Hunger wins out every time. Yeah. Any recommendations for a flowering dogwood or something similar for full sun? A couple of really specific things here, zone 5 to 6 and under 15 feet in height.
So again, I'm going to point out Monrovia is my plant finder. It's such a great resource for any of these things. But a couple of my recommendations, I would say most flowering dogwoods are going to be about 20 feet or so. It might be hard to get under 15. Summer gold is a dogwood that does stay right around 8 to 15 feet though. The caveat there is that it's a golden variegated variety, so we'd probably like a little bit of shade. So maybe not full sun. But an alternative that might work maybe would be a cercis or redbud. I really love this. It could be a good alternative. They flower in the spring, they can handle full sun, and there's a lot of smaller varieties on the market that are absolutely stunning. So Ruby Falls or Lavender Twists, they're gonna be more like weeping varieties. They're gonna be 8 feet tall or so at max. If you want something a little bit bigger, there's a beautiful white flowering variety that's called Vanilla Twist. And that's going to be 12 to 15 feet, so right around where you want it. There's also a larger variety that I love. It's sort of a classic called Oklahoma, and it has these beautiful bright purpley pink flowers and going to be right around 15 feet. So that might be a better option, but by all means, you can always try something like a summer gold dogwood.
Great recommendations. Those sound beautiful. Next one is, are there any Agapanthus that can survive to zone 5 or 6?
Midnight Blue, also Northern Star. Those are considered zone 6. There's one that can be pushed to zone 5, the only one that I know of at least, which is called Blue Yonder. I would recommend though some extra mulching and protection because Agapanthus typically are a little bit iffy. And if you're a zone 5, a true zone 5, you might want a little extra layer of mulch.
Great tips there. So we had lots of viewers that were looking for specific companion plant recommendations. One specific question was about camellias, specifically Monrovia's Victory Camellia. And this viewer said they have sedums and daffodils at the base, but they're looking for recommendations for some annual flowers to pair. Any thoughts there?
Well, my thought, Katie, if you've got more, by all means, but was annuals, at least from my experience, can be tricky with camellias since they do bloom in that winter time. So January to March, I believe, is when Victory's in bloom. Mm-hmm. That would be that's my first thought. I don't know if I necessarily have a recommendation though.
Yeah, like you, I was thinking what blooms in winter, and it varies, right? If you're in California or, compared to Georgia, what you might be able to put there. So you've got us stumped.
A stumper for sure.
Yeah,
maybe something that blooms afterward, kind of to take over the color, which opens up pretty much any annual.
Right. So, and it's interesting thinking about annuals, because I tend to in my garden, and I'm in zone 10, in California, I plant a lot of perennials because I can get that color like for a long time too. So I don't necessarily think so much about, annuals planted in my garden. I do a lot of annuals in containers. So I think that's why I'm sort of stumped with this one. I have to think about it. maybe in the course of our chat, I'll come back to that one.
There you go. Another follow-up. And here I'm in zone 4, and here in the north, annuals are instant color. So I think of, once something quits blooming, then you can throw some annuals in there to add that instant color. So it's so, zone specific and regional specific as well. Let's see, any recommendations for companion plants at the base of pink flowered crepe myrtles?
Pink flowered. Well, I like, I like the sort of pink and purple combo. I think that goes together so nicely. And in terms of what might grow really well at the base of the crepe myrtles, I mean, salvia, lavender, get that sort of pop of color. That's a really nice pairing. And, they all love the sun. They all love the same exposure. I don't know, Georgia, what you think?
Yeah, I also, salvias were on my list as well, as were echinacea. I think echinacea, just something that comes in a lot of variety of color, depending on, do you want to keep it with pinks or do you want to add some other tones in there? All those would be really beautiful. If you have a larger, I know sometimes crepe myrtles can create a little bit of shade and acts more of like a shade tree. So I think liriope can bring some color, hostas as well. I think it's important to remember that crepe myrtles are shallow rooters and they don't need a lot of water. They don't need a lot of nitrogen. And so choose plants that, sort of like to be on the drier side. They don't need a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. Those all make good companion plants. And I think Katie's recommendations and then the liriope and the hosta all fit that bill.
Wonderful recommendations and combinations too. So last one on combinations, looking for a good companion for rhododendrons.
Well, azaleas do well with rhododendrons. Hydrangea. Let's see. Laurels can do well too with rhodies. Georgia, what's on your list of what might be a good pairing?
Yeah, I was thinking, underplanting with perennial color. So I was thinking
heuchera would be good.
Yeah, maybe some bleeding heart.
Oh yeah.
There's a beautiful garden. There's a beautiful rhododendron garden just down the road, a few hours down the road. And they have this beautiful sweet woodruff ground cover. So, acid lovers, high organic matter, shade plants.
Yeah.
Anything like that fits your style.
I think what's great, so there's a really pretty sort of mauve or light purple rhododendron, and it looks so good with the dark heuchera, the Sirens song, dark heuchera. That pairing looks fantastic. But you can also pair it with, you know, beautiful like white flowers. Oh, Pieris actually is another great pairing. So I like that rhodies. You can totally change the look and style of your garden depending on what you pair it with. So.
Great suggestions. So now we kind of launch into some plant care questions. We have lots of comments about zestful grape and grapes in general. And during the webinar, we talked about the fact that when you buy a zestful grape from Monrovia, the plant is mature enough to fruit. But we had a question about tips for growing grapes. Specifically, one of the viewers wanted to know what they could do to make their fruit larger. They were saying that their fruit is really very small, and they're in zone 9, if that helps.
Yeah, well, first, different varieties of grapes will produce different sizes of grapes. But with that being said, grapes do need to be pruned pretty heavily during the dormant season, or else the fruit will get really small. I know that's been a trouble with grapes that I've seen in home gardens, is often not being pruned hard enough. I'll say that I'm not an expert on pruning grapes, but there are a lot of them hanging out on YouTube if you need help with that. Also, another thing is that sometimes thinning out the clusters before they're fruiting is really helpful. Oftentimes your grapes are gonna put out more clusters than it can actually nourish and take care of, resulting in your individual grapes not receiving what they need, so being really small. So when the flowers are finished, you can remove clusters that are either too big or too little, or if there's too many per branch, you know, you might just want a couple per branch. You can remove the excess. I'll also say that the grapes that you see in the store, if that's your mark, don't make that your mark, because a lot of commercial growers are using things like gibberellic acid and other sort of things that are available to those commercial growers that might not necessarily be viable for the home gardener. But pruning can really help.
Great tips. So let's see, one of the questions we had was around Agapanthus and how to keep them thriving, how to have them bloom, and can they be brought indoors into a sunroom?
So Agapanthus really like a lot of sun. That's usually a big reason why they're not blooming. When they don't get enough sun, they stop flowering. They also are pretty finicky with dividing. So if you divide them too early or when they're too young, that can delay their flowering for sometimes 2 to 3 years. So they really like their roots to be a little bit crowded. The rule of thumb that I've always heard is dividing every 4 years or so is going to be okay. Also, fertilizing in the spring can be helpful too. And then the second part of the question about bringing them into the sunroom, yes, you can. The key there is, again, for the flowering purposes, you want to make sure they're resting at a cooler temperature in the winter. They like a little bit of cool. So the deciduous types prefer a little bit colder. So I think it's 40 to 50 degrees over the winter is right around where you want to keep them. The evergreen types, a little bit warmer. They're a little bit less hardy. So 55 to 60 degrees or so. So if you can hit those, not keep them too warm, they should be okay and flowering for you the next year.
That sounds really helpful. Great. So switching gears a little bit, viewers were really loving Dark Star 9 barks. We have a number of questions around that. First of all, is it an evergreen and does it need acidic soil?
It is not an evergreen. It's deciduous, and it does prefer that slightly acidic to neutral soil, but it's 9 bark and they can tolerate a lot of different soil conditions. It's not super finicky.
Excellent. One viewer asked specifically if it would grow in North Texas and New Mexico, which I did a little research, and I think that's probably zone 7, 8.
Yeah, so it's recommended zone 4 through 8. So I would say it's possible. If 9-bark grows well in your area already, then I would suspect that Dark Star would grow really well for you too. But again, I wish I knew every climate inside and out, but, but sadly.
There's still time, Georgia. You can...
Yeah.
That would be amazing.
Yes, it would. My superpower.
There you go. There you go. A couple of general 9-bark questions. Is there a 9-bark that is hardy to zone 10?
Not that I'm aware of, unless Katie has one in her garden. Not
No, I don't have any 9-bark. I wish. Yeah.
Yeah.
So beautiful. And they do really well up here in the north. The other question is there a truly powdery mildew resistant 9-bark?
So, well, I have a long-winded answer to this. So UConn did a large powdery mildew study, University of Connecticut, a few years ago, and found that really the only cultivar with no sign of mildew at all was Nanus, which is the cultivar, sort of a green, large, kind of gangly plant, in my opinion. In that study, though, a lot of the newer varieties showed really, really, really good resistance. And since that study, more breeding has come out. Dark Stars come out of these newer breeding works, and the resistance has just gotten better and better. It's something we watch for closely in all of our trialings with Physocarpus because we know it's an issue. And we feel there's some really good resistance out there, but we can't confidently say that there's many that are 100% impervious to the powdery mildew.
Right. And I think, that's with any claim. You can't say 100% with anything. You just never know.
Yeah.
So switching gears to lilacs, we had a viewer that wanted to know, will Little Darling lilac tolerate alkaline soil?
Yes. Yeah. They should do fine in a slightly alkaline soil. Actually, I think lilacs sort of prefer a slightly alkaline to a slightly acidic soil.
Excellent. And then we have another pest question, something that I know I've struggled with a little bit. One viewer has an issue with Japanese beetles and asked if the pest is attracted to nitty-gritty roses.
So nitty-gritties, as far as I know, will be no more or less susceptible to the Japanese beetle. Those are relatively, unfortunately, aggressive and new pests. And I think that we're going to start to see a lot more breeding involved with Japanese beetle resistance. But as right now, we don't have anything that's more or less susceptible.
Excellent. Would seaside serenade hydrangeas do well in Colorado and specifically in the Boulder area? Very specific.
So I would say if hydrangeas do well in your area, if you see them around, if you see them at your garden center, then these should do just fine. Mm-hmm. I would also say that because the seaside serenades as a group are really tough, so the foliage, the flower, the stems, they might even be a little bit easier to grow in those sort of drier climates. So I would just take a look around, and if you see hydrangeas in any form, hydrangea macrophyllus, then I would feel confident to put them in your garden.
Mm-hmm. And I would say the other thing is wondering, is it in a container or is it in the landscape? Thinking about your soil, is important, because I know, this is not Boulder, Colorado, but in Utah, in the Utah area, they struggle sometimes with the alkalinity of the soil, and certain hydrangeas not doing as well. So
many factors for all plants, for sure. So we had one viewer that had some concerns about Sunbelievable sunflower in a very hot climate. They were using it as a container plant. So any tips for them?
Well, anytime you do have something in a container in the, extreme heat, you've got to think about the water needs might be different than if you're planting it in a landscape. So just something to think about. They're not, they're not succulents, so they do need water. So if they're sort of struggling, that might be something to think about. Georgia, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, that would be my suggestion also. I think that water in the container is really crucial. Sunbelievable is, I would say, more drought tolerant than a lot of other sunflowers, but it's not you know, like Katie mentioned, it's not a succulent.
Mm-hmm.
Typically they do well in a hot environment. So I would maybe try to give it another shot next year and see if a little bit extra water would help.
Mm-hmm.
Containers can be really thirsty, even up here in the north in a really hot, sunny area. So that's great advice. So now we had a question with a plant that I am not familiar with. It's called a Brazilian giant rhubarb, and I'm not even going to try the Latin name. The viewer had it in a pot and is wondering where they should put it in the landscape and how to keep it tame.
Yeah, Gunnera, I'm pretty sure that's what, yeah, it's such a cool plant. I would say it can be hard to keep Gunnera tame. The leaves can be.
I have Gunnera actually in my garden, and yeah, it's like I don't know, it's like Jurassic Park, you know, prehistoric. They get really big suddenly, they, you know, and I think that's one of the reasons I love it, is that it just like pops up suddenly one day and it gets really crazy, and then it kind of, you know, dies back.
Yeah, the leaves can be like 4 feet across, just insane. I'm jealous of your Gunnera in your garden, Katie. I'm gonna have to plant one in mine.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah, so where they should put it in the landscape, I'm sure Katie will share where she has hers in the landscape, but you know, a high moisture content is what it's really looking for. So somewhere like wet and boggy, high moisture is really key.
Yeah,
So
I
have a pretty shady, woodsy, you know, section of my garden, and that's where they are. So
excellent. So next question, does Enchanted Forest Pieris have issues with lacewing infestation?
So yeah, just like other Pieris, they can be susceptible to lacewing issues, though we have seen not as bad as some other varieties, but they can still get some lacewing damage.
Sounds good. How does Plumshine Japanese anise tree get? How big does it get? And how can it be grown in a pot in a sunroom?
So I've never tried growing it in a sunroom, but I think it would be fun to try. They are slower growing. They're going to be about 5 feet tall by 4 feet wide.
Great. Question about Superlicious Blackberry. Can it be grown in a container, and does it require a lot of fertilizer?
Yes, it can be grown in a container.
Yeah, and for the fertilizer question, it doesn't really need a lot of fertilizer. Blackberries aren't super heavy feeders. I would fertilize it when the new growth starts up in the spring, and then it could be beneficial maybe at the end of spring to give it another little spritz of fertilizer, but not heavy feeders.
Excellent. One last question in this category. Can you recommend a juniper or other evergreen that does well in clay soil?
I don't know. I mean, is icy blue juniper, which is sort of, I think of it as one of the most like flexible junipers, you know, because it goes from zone 3 to zone 9. But is that one, Georgia, that could be okay in clay?
Yeah, I would say so. And I would say that most junipers generally would do okay in clay soil. They just have to be well drained. They don't really like to be in really wet, boggy clay soil.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Now we have what I'm calling the speed round questions. You ready, Georgia? I don't think any of these are going to stump you. They're just like really quick and easy. So hopefully. Does Monrovia have an evergreen red flowered rhododendron, possibly known as Firestorm?
Yes, I will say Firestorm. We no longer grow, but we do have some other red flowering ones. Henry's red, I think Trilby, Taurus. There's a lot of beautiful red flowering rhodies that we grow.
Perfect. How tall is Seaside Serenade Bar Harbor?
4 feet tall.
Does the Seaside Serenade series bloom on old or new wood? And is it hardy to zone 4?
They are hardy to zone 4. And Kathleen, you told me that they die back to the ground like most others. And so that's great because they also bloom on both old and new wood. So even if they die back to the ground, you'll still get your flowers.
Yep, my zone 4 friends, they do very well here. How tall is Lilith smoke bush?
4 feet tall, about 4 feet tall by 4 feet wide.
And that's really fantastic because I have a Catinus in my garden that's way too big. I'm constantly trying to, contain it. So I love Lilith smoke bush. As you get that wonderful, that wonderful accent that Catinus provides, but it stays nice and compact.
It's so beautiful. It's on my wish list this year for sure. How big does ginger love fountain grass get?
That's about a medium-sized fountain grass on the smaller side, so 2 to 3 feet tall or so at max in the garden.
Sounds good. How wide does upstanding emerald arborvitae get?
We are putting that at 15 feet tall and 8 feet wide about. So much more tall than it is wide.
Sounds good. What is the zone recommendation for Sunbelievable? Ooh, trick question.
That's an annual.
That's right. Yeah.
I didn't even notice that until just now. So yes, definitely an annual. How big does Little Ragu Sweet Bay get?
So that's much more compact. It's going to be 6 to 8 feet tall at maximum, and about that wide as well.
Great. How tall will Golden Duke Eastern Hemlock grow?
So those are going to be about 6 to 10 feet tall, I'd say, 2 to 3 feet wide, and that's in 10 years. So, in 20 years, it may outgrow that a little bit, but it's a really slow grower. So 6 to 10 feet tall is about what you can expect.
Excellent job on the speed round. That covers everything that everyone asked. So thank you, Katie. Thank you, Georgia, for all of that great information. I really can't wait for our next webinar. So stay tuned for more details. Thanks, ladies.
This was
Thank
great.
you, Kathleen.
Thank you. Thanks for all the great questions.